I want to talk real quick because I know we're 38 minutes past the top of the hour about um, Toronto cops saying the quiet part out loud. Let's show this clip from Leviathan. If you don't follow him on X, you
The
should.
awesome.
It, yep,
Absolutely awesome. Yeah.
especially on this issue, especially on the Hamas nonsense in Toronto and across the country, but largely this is Toronto is just a breeding ground along with Montreal in this. Officer Farhan of the Toronto Police calls out uh, wording of Hamas rallies. Despite each rally we watch and analyze, there being full of imagery and references to Hamas or designated terrorist entities, which of course is illegal. Hamas is an outlawed terrorist entity in this country. And yet these guys are like, don't call them Hamas rallies. They're just rallies with full of Hamas supporters and Hamas flags. Okay.
Everyone's well aware, and that is something that we celebrate in Canada, the freedom of speech. However, when we have somebody labeling a certain group as something they're not, all of a sudden now it becomes, when there's an Islamophobic undertone, if someone is calling a Palestinian rally a Hamas rally, then all of a sudden people start getting afraid. And they think, oh, wow, these are people that support an entity that's been labeled as a terrorist organization. However, the people that are there protesting, they're there for a different cause altogether. So then that becomes active discrimination when you classify an entire group with a group that they don't even identify with. So that's the challenge.
And it creates fear, right? It creates curfew within different communities.
Confusion, fear. And it creates a divide.
It's funny you
Everyone's well aware, and that is something that we celebrate in Canada.
Is he the press secretary for these Hamas rallies? Because he's sure trying to make the case for why, if you don't want to see people who are supporters of the genocidal actions of Hamas on October 7th, marching in your streets, flying the banner of Hamas, wearing the symbols of Hamas. If you don't want to see that, you're Islamophobic, according to this guy. Unbelievable.
Okay,
no wonder they're bringing them coffee on the streets.
and not to point out the obvious, but maybe we shouldn't trust law enforcement in Canada that doesn't actually know the laws. What he said was, we have freedom of speech in Canada. We actually don't, Farhan. Did you know that, buddy? Did you know that we don't have freedom of speech in Canada? We have something under our charter called freedom of expression. Freedom of expression. And this freedom of expression can be dialed back. So, and we've seen it happen under the
Well,
censorship regime of the Liberal Party of Canada over these last 9 years. We don't have freedom of speech in Canada. So if we like if there is one guy that should not be trusted to speak on these things in Canada, it's that guy. He just told us he's not trustworthy. And
well,
obviously he's on side of the Hamas supporters. Like
Well,
obviously.
he's making excuses for them. I mean, freedom of expression would include freedom of speech, but freedom of speech under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is subject to reasonable limitations. And those reasonable limitations include hate speech. Now, what the
Yes.
left calls hate speech and what Canadians call hate speech are much different things. But
Two totally different things.
when you are on the streets of Toronto with a flag of an outlawed terrorist organization, and the police are saying, well, don't call these Hamas rallies. They're just people who are supportive of Hamas, fly the symbols of Hamas, wear the symbols of Hamas, and are anti-Jew in that they will show up in Jewish neighborhoods, stage Hamas cosplays of dead
Yes.
terrorists, show up on the lawns of synagogues because there are real estate presentations where Jews might move into certain neighborhoods in Israel and then fight the Jews on the lawns of the synagogue. So they have all, like, they are apologizing for Hamas, wearing the symbols of
Yes.
Hamas, doing all the things that
Yes.
a Hamas supporter would do.
Yes.
But don't you dare call them a Hamas organization because we have freedom of speech. We do have freedom of speech. It is subject to reasonable limitations, and that includes hate speech. And I would suggest that flying the symbols of a hate organization would fall under that provision.
no, really,
constable.
Sheila. The symbolism that they're using is equivalent to flying swastikas in the streets of Canada. We would not tolerate that as a civilized society, and nor should we tolerate the symbolism of declared terrorist organizations on the streets of Canada. And yet our institutions have been so corrupted and have been so degraded by the federal Liberals and their weak on crime policies that these guys just have free reign. I mean, it is the Canada that we live in right now was unthinkable 10 years ago, and yet here we are. Here we are.
Yeah, we wouldn't say, like, to your point with the Nazi imagery or the swastika, we wouldn't say if someone were flying a Nazi flag, we wouldn't say, look, that's not a hate rally. It's just pro-German. We would never say that, right? Like, we would never say that, but that's what they are saying with the Hamas stuff. And what's the distinction? Hamas feels the same way against Jews that the Nazis felt, but you would never in a million years have a cop say that.
Yes. And as a German,
right,
I would take the head off of any person that flew a swastika on the streets of Canada. I would take their head off in that second. That would be they would have
metaphorically
big life
speaking.
regrets about
Metaphorically speaking.
Sorry, yes, theoretically speaking, yes, no, all of this, no, but you know what I mean. It would be absolutely unthinkable for me to be able to, or unthinkable for and for the majority of Canadians to see swastikas being flown with pride on the streets of Canada. Why are we tolerating this? Why are we tolerating this? Canada was built on Judeo-Christian values. These are the values that must be upheld above everything else.
Right.
Canada, and that this has become so widespread is just unthinkable. It's just unthinkable.
We must think of it that way. We must think that when we see the Hamas flags, when we see those symbols of Hamas, for Canada's Jewish community, it is the same to them as seeing a swastika.
Yes, it is an exact equivalency. That is exactly right. And Canadians must think the same thing. When you see those Hamas flags, what in your head, what you should say, oh, that is the modern day swastika. That is the modern day swastika.
And we wouldn't tolerate a cop making excuses for that and calling the other side, like, if anti-German. We would never. The cop should lose his job, to be frank.
He'd be instantaneously fired. He'd be instantaneously fired. There would be riots outside, not riots, but there would be an uprising outside the police stations of any police force that let that happen. And yet this is modern day Canada. It is a sad story. And
the Toronto police published that. They thought that was something that they should publish and that people would appreciate, if you can even believe that.
Like how tone deaf, how absolutely tone deaf is this organization. But this is also an organization, along with many, many other police forces in Canada, that prioritize the reporting of hate crimes. So this is against any group that has so-called oppression points, I guess. These are people that on the oppression hierarchy are encouraged to report their hurt feelings as hate crimes, whereas people, especially Canada's Jewish community, who are actually experiencing hate crimes, have their concerns and their complaints, thrown out.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It is crazy. The two-tier policing in Regina is, not in Regina, in Canada, is just insane.
Yeah, I mean, how many Jewish girls' schools have to be shut up in Toronto before we figure out who's responsible?
Oh, hi, it's Ezra Levant here in Toronto with an important message because we need your help. Independent journalism in Canada is under attack. Government censors, big tech deplatformers, and the dying legacy media are all working together to maintain exclusive control on the information you receive. They don't want you to hear other voices like ours, and they really don't want you to be informed and to think for yourself. That's why the work we do here at Rebel News is so important. Our on-the-ground reporting, independent news shows, and special content you won't find anywhere else. It's all designed to give you trustworthy information and alternative viewpoints so you can decide for yourself. We don't get government money, and we are not owned by some big global conglomerate. We're funded by people just like you, so please support independent journalism and help us continue our work by subscribing and becoming a Rebel News Plus member today, right here on the page. Go to rebelnewsplus.com.